here's Ed Bernstein.
What happens when you pass? Does your consciousness remain? Well, with me to talk about that is Mark Gober, and a little bit later in the show, we have Dr. Kenneth Fine is going to be here to talk about how music can heal you. You wrote a book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. By the way, the title is great.
Thank you.
And what is so upside down with our thinking when it comes to life and death?
So the conventional thinking in most of modern science and even most of modern society says the basic, the following. And this is getting really deep quickly. I recognize that for many people.
That's a dive right in.
Okay, so we're talking about the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago.
Right.
Fills the universe with physical stuff that we call matter, like our table's made of matter, atoms.
Right.
When you have this big universe with a lot of matter in it, you're bound through chance to end up with matter that's interacting. We call that chemistry. Started with matter, we got chemistry. With enough random chemical reactions, you're bound through chance to end up with a self-replicating molecule like DNA. Biology. DNA leads to the evolution of a human being, develops a brain, and then consciousness comes out of the brain. In other words, our awareness. So I'm sitting here speaking with you right now. That subjective inner experience that I can't touch, but it's there. That's what I mean by consciousness. So we start with matter, we end up with consciousness through a brain. And that's what I'm arguing is upside down.
So you end up with consciousness through the brain, and the consciousness is less through infinity, or it doesn't?
Well, so I would argue that it does, and that this conventional view that matter creates consciousness by way of a brain is not correct, and that consciousness actually comes first. So the physical world is an experience within consciousness. Consciousness is almost preceding matter, which means that when the body is dying, that means the consciousness, which isn't dependent on the body, is just transitioning into a different state.
Now, you're a businessman, an investment banker.
Yeah.
Right? What are you doing dabbling in the spiritual world?
It wasn't something that I had planned on initially, but I think my first interests were actually in college. So I was at Princeton University, and I wanted to major in astrophysics because I wanted to understand the universe. But I was on the tennis team, later the captain of the team there, and I was too busy. So I couldn't do it, put those interests aside, went into investment banking during the financial crisis. So I was at UBS.
Oh, you forgot to predict that one, right?
My first day was July of 2008.
Yeah.
So yeah, I didn't time the markets very well.
Yeah.
It was an interesting experience. Then I went to my current firm called Sherpa Technology Group. I'm a partner there in Silicon Valley, advising tech companies. So what does this have to do with consciousness?
Right.
It was about 2 years ago that I first became exposed to these ideas, and it was kind of a random thing. I was listening to podcasts, and for the first time I heard a woman on a health podcast describing working with energy and communicating with the deceased. And I wasn't taking it seriously. But I remember at the end of that podcast, the woman's name is Laura Powers. She said, well, I have my own podcast where I interview other people who have these experiences called Healing Powers. So I said, okay, I'll turn that on in the car when I'm driving to work in San Francisco down to the peninsula.
Right.
And as I listened to more and more episodes over a few weeks, I got confused because I heard many people describing similar things about psychic abilities, about surviving bodily death. I had never heard of these things before in a serious way. So I said, okay, I can't reason that they're all delusional or that they're all lying. I want to explore it a bit further. And that's when I learned of science that I had no idea was out there, coming from Princeton University, the University of Virginia, even the US government. And that led me down the path of intense research for a year, which culminated in my writing a book over a few weekends in July 2017. And it's all about this notion of consciousness and whether it's residing in the brain.
Now, when you talk about the science of this, I mean, isn't there science on both sides of that issue? I mean, there's been, I guess, clinical studies saying, hey, no, there is no ESP, okay, for lack of a better word, or psychic ability, and there's been science on proving that there is.
Yeah. Well, the way I think about it now, having done the research, is to start with some of the assumptions in mainstream society even that are actually unproven. So there's one about the brain producing consciousness. I didn't realize that Science magazine has called this the #2 question that remains in all of science. How does a physical body produce a consciousness? So I can touch my arm, I can't touch my mind.
Right.
How does something physical that you can touch produce something non-physical? So number one, there's a question it's not understood. However, we do know that there's a relationship between our brain and our consciousness. Someone gets in a car accident, they have memory loss. There's a strong correlation. Now, this is the potential error. It doesn't prove anything, but it's a potential error. Just because two things are related doesn't mean that one always causes the other.
Right.
So a very basic example, if you have a fire, lots of firefighters show up. A bigger fire, more firefighters show up. Did the firefighters cause the fire? We know they didn't, but there is a relationship between the two.
Right.
So I'm proposing an alternative, which is that the brain is related to consciousness, but it's more like an antenna receiver or a filtering mechanism that is processing something that's not produced by the body, that exists independently. So that's just the framework for this potential alternative.
So when you how do you coordinate these beliefs with religious beliefs?
Well, my approach before I got into this was not a very spiritual one at all. But what I've realized as I've gotten into the science of this is that many of the mystical traditions throughout basically every tradition in history has talked about a similar idea of a transcendent consciousness of which we're all a part. So even the Eastern traditions, but also Western religions, Judaism, Kabbalah, which is the mystical tradition, Gnosticism and Christianity, Sufism and Islam, talk about similar ideas, is what I found.
Right. So what is your belief of what happens after one dies?
Well, we have some evidence, and it's bits and pieces that we can take from the science. I think the near-death experience, which is chapter 9 of An End to Upside Down Thinking, tells us something. And these are instances, and I would have told you a few years ago that isn't a near-death experience just a hallucination that someone has before they die because the brain spits out chemicals to make us feel good. But now I think something is happening that's more than that, which gives us hints into your question. We have instances where people have cardiac arrest and there's no blood flowing to their brain, and yet they're having a very lucid experience, sometimes hovering over their body and describing what happens in the room accurately. They also describe like a feeling of unconditional love, and they talk about a life review where they experience their whole life in a flash, and in some cases they experience it from the perspective of those they affected. So let's say Bob is having a life review during his near-death experience. During his life he harmed Jane. During the life review he might experience that event through Jane's eyes and feel the pain that he inflicted upon her. And then he comes back into his body and says, oh my goodness, what matters in life is more about how we're treating each other. So it's a very profound thing if that's actually the reality we're in and not a hallucination.
Right, and look, that's been studied a lot. I mean, there's been what's his name, Brian Weiss, who wrote Many Lives, Many Masters, and he was a physician, right? He was a scientist who then, who was very rigid in his thinking about the afterlife, and then as a physician and a surgeon, he witnessed himself some of the things you're talking about.
He did, and he was using a technique of hypnosis to kind of calm the mind. And if we think of the brain as being like an antenna, something like meditation or hypnosis will quiet the mind and allow information to come in. And what he found in his patients is that all kinds of information was coming in.
How about predicting the future?
Well, if we think of conventional views of time, that is totally impossible. But if we think of consciousness as being beyond space and time and beyond the material, then it becomes at least conceptually possible. I have a chapter on something called precognition, which is this very idea that maybe our consciousness can reach forward in the future. It's a controversial area, as are many of these topics, but there are studies that suggest that even the body is subtly reacting to the future before the future is known.
In what regard?
Okay, so the classic study that's been done by many researchers, and when you combine the results, you find that there's a statistical effect. So the basic study is like this. It's reversing a typical psychological study where if I show you a picture of a violent scene, we know that the body responds afterwards. The question is, if the person doesn't know that a violent picture is going to be shown, does their body react before? Who would ever think to measure that? Some people have. And what they find is that before a computer randomly generates a picture, their skin is subtly reacting. Their eyes, their pupils dilate subtly. So it seems that the body or consciousness is somehow reaching forward in time by a few seconds, very subtly, to know the future. And if that's true, then our basic assumptions about time have to be questioned.
And how about people just have greater intuition? I mean, some people, my wife just seems to have it. I think women have it more than men, by the way.
So there are theories on this, and I think we need to explore it further, but there's a notion of a left hemisphere of the brain and a right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is like logic, the right hemisphere is creativity and intuition.
Right.
And people who tend to have in heightened abilities have a stronger right brain. And some of the research I've looked at suggests that women have strong right brains. So maybe they are naturally more in tune because their brains are structured in a different way. But I think it needs to be researched more.
And what about the returning in some other form after one passes?
Well, again, this is an idea that I never really considered before I looked at the research, but the University of Virginia, the Division of Perceptual Studies at the med school, for 50 years has been studying this very topic of little children, usually between the ages of 2 and 5 years old, who start spontaneously speaking of a life that's not theirs, and they have preferences that don't make sense, like craving tobacco or alcohol. And sometimes the researchers are able to find a person that died in the exact manner that the child describes. And in the most compelling cases to me are where there are physical deformities or birthmarks that match what the child describes in their death in this alleged previous life. And then the researchers are able to find someone that had that exact incident. So for me, this notion of a kind of continuation of consciousness from one body into something else, it aligns with that research.
Right. And how does all of this relate to God, you know, to a supreme being?
It's a really big question. That is a word that I think people have different associations with, and people have attribute different meaning to it.
Energy, God, whatever you want to call
Right.
it. Yeah, there's some intelligent something for us out there, right?
Well, the way I think about things based on the research I've done is that everything is consciousness in some form, so that basically everything that we're in is part of the whole. And whatever you want to call that, you know, this is where the mystical traditions have all weighed in and said that consciousness is the primary structure in the universe and we're all connected as part of it. Right. And I think that's what they mean.
Yeah. There's a great line in Tuesdays with Maury, written by Mitch Albom, when he's talking about a story. Maury's talking about a story of a little wave and a big wave, and the little wave starts crying, and the big wave comes up next to the little wave. Why are you crying, little wave? He said, look at the end of the shoreline. I'm just going to hit the beach and die. And the big wave starts laughing. He says, oh, little wave, you got it wrong. See, you're not really a wave. You're just part of the ocean. Never done.
Yeah, well, it's an analogy that I actually use in and into upside down thinking, to think of all of reality like a stream of water.
Right.
So each of us is like a whirlpool. So we have our localized individual experience, but we're part of the big stream.
Yes, we are. The name of the book is An End to Upside Down Thinking. Mark Gober. Thank you, Mark. Really interesting stuff.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good thing you have insurance. The lady in front of you just called that Bernstein.
Enough said. Call Ed. EdBernstein.com.
I was walking down a lonesome road, humming a familiar song, thinking that the time has come, for it has been way too long. I'm ready for a renaissance, a real estate to grow. Never mind appearances that show.
I hope you're enjoying that music. With me now is Dr. Kenneth Fine, the singer and composer of that piece.
Yes.
And however, with the unique quirk that the word doctor is in front of your name.
That's true.
Right? So what is a doctor doing playing country music?
Well, you know, I could be a doctor of music, but I'm not. I'm a doctor of medicine and a gastroenterologist by specialty. The reason I have combined music with my health work is that it wouldn't let me be. It asked to be a part, and it became a part in a motto that I call for your health, happiness, and hope. And when I developed that concept, I decided the happiness was going to be my music, the health was going to be my health, and the hope was going to be the inspirational side of my mission. And so while on the one hand we're here to talk about the scientific aspect of music being healing, I have to say I kind of did this you know, intuitively.
Why do you consider music to be healing?
Well, in my experience, and you know, I happen to be Jewish, and the ancient priests, you know, the high priests, were also the doctors. So in history, and really in all cultures, the spiritual leader is often the medical or medicine man as well. And it's almost always true that, like in Judaism we have cantors, there's always music as part of the inspirational aspect of religion. Well, so too is that in the medicine side of the spiritual leader. And truthfully, I think I feel like I'm drawing from the past, you know. In fact, there's a title track of the second CD of my new one called Rockspirational. It's called 4,000 Years of Anticipation, and it's a little bit about, you know, how I think our present lives draw from the past, whether it's our past lives or just of the historic past. But that's how it came to me to do that.
Now, of course, there's a long-standing connection between music and medicine. You know, you watch television shows, you see doctors go into surgery listening to music when they're trying to calm a patient. They're often playing certain types of music. I mean, look, you can't walk through a hospital without certain areas of the hospital having certain types of music. I mean, they go out of their way to try to connect it to. But you being a gastroenterologist, you know, you are trained to deal with diseases of the gut. Mm-hmm. And I've always heard there is a relationship between the gut and the brain. There's a direct line between those two. And if you don't believe me, if you have a stomach ache, you know what your brain is thinking, right?
That's
you know
true.
what kind of mood that puts you in.
Yeah. Well, the comment about music in hospitals, there's always been the concept of music therapy, which is for the patient. So the patient interacts with the musical instruments, the musical occupational therapist. But now we have what we call therapeutic musicians, where professional musicians actually go into hospitals. They go to bedsides, they go to kind of high stress diagnostic areas, again, to calm, to be, you know, an anti-anxiety effect. And as far as the brain and music, number one, there's a strong connection in our research. You know, this is really not too surprising, an idea that, you know, music affects our emotions are from our brain and vice versa. But there's no question, both from a hormone and a neurologic point of view, we even call the gut the second brain.
Yeah, so what happens, is there a particular type of music that it works better? Look, if you're a big fan of hard rock, is a hard rock driving sound going to relax somebody, or do they need Burt Bacharach?
You know, both are right, and there's not just Burt Bacharach, but Bach. You know, classical music seems to be the most uplifting music for our energetic health. These things have been studied with a concept called behavioral kinesiology. It's often tested with muscle testing. If anyone's ever been to a therapist and they test your strength of your deltoid, what you can show is music will strengthen a person's energy. However, as long as the beat and the rhythm is rhythmic. So the heart, we really play, you know, like you're probably familiar with, like, babies, you know, they have these new concepts where while the baby is sleeping in its crib, you put on a monitor that has, that mimics, you know, the uterine heartbeat that they heard in the womb for all those months. And so there's definitely something that our nervous system from, you know, in utero connects to a straight rhythm. And when that rhythm gets what we call syncopated, that throws our energy off and it weakens us. And there's certain lyrics, for example, negativity in the words will also weaken us. But it's also been studied, the difference between what we consider classic rock versus, like almost what they call death metal. Death metal, not good. Classic rock's good.
So how do you go about utilizing music to treat an ailment?
Well, and I have to confess, and we talked about it earlier, that I'm not, the kind of doctor that sees patients in an office day to day. If I was, I probably wouldn't play my instrument and sing to them. I'd probably hand them a CD. But the way I got onto this, and what I call my voice is my instrument, okay? And that's my tool for healing as well. In fact, that's even in mystical Judaism, in the Kabbalah, which people mostly know from a very famous musician, Madonna. I always say Madonna popularized Kabbalah in pop culture. The words coming out of the mouth is where the physician's compassion and love and healing power comes from. And oftentimes, historically, with melody and therefore with music. So singing rather than, just speaking. But the way I got onto it personally is when I would watch my audiences. And in my programs, I speak and educate. And then we take a little, often food break and change gears, and I pick up my instruments. Sometimes I have my band, sometimes it's just me. And I sing and do my inspirational music or my straight music. And I watch the faces and I watch the responses and the feedback. And it's really an equal response to when I'm speaking as a physician or when I'm singing as a physician musician.
Look, everybody I'm sure knows that if you're playing, a nice melody to somebody who's not feeling well, you're going to see a smile on their face, or you're going to feel better. But is there a science behind that?
There really is. I know, I will say anecdotally for myself and for others who have documented such, patients in nursing homes, dementia patients. I had an experience once where a patient was on a declining course from Parkinson's, and he stopped speaking and he was not able to much move anymore. And I brought my guitar in and sang a few songs, and I felt connected to this man. I happened to know him personally. And sure enough, when I asked, should I do another one, he vocalized the word yes, And his wife was so surprised that he spoke, because he hadn't spoken in months. Mm-hmm. And I will say also that, that experience was created in the movie Awakenings, if you can remember that movie. Right. That was a different concept, that would be using a drug. But that doctor, Dr. Oliver Sacks, I think has recently passed away. He was a British neurologist, and he himself was a musician, and he was a composer, and he was a piano player. And he has written a lot about the effects of music, not only on the brain and health, but some very interesting professional anecdotes of, like, when a disorder of the brain happens, music will happen sometimes. Like, people hear symphonies in their head or they become musicians suddenly, things like that. So sometimes in neurology, for example, we use disease to kind of backtrack towards, well, if this is happening when this brain is diseased, that there must be a normal center there that's disrupted. So there's all of that anecdotal experience, and then of course there are indeed studies now showing how it's anti-anxiety effect, it makes our mood more positive. Certainly there's even effects on the immune system, much like there have been studies on laughter and love and healing and things like that. In fact, I would say that if you looked at the studies of music, laughter, love, and gratitude, they tend to have the same outcomes.
And you know what I like about what you're saying is that these are things within our control. So oftentimes getting ill is not within our control.
That's true.
But how you manage that illness, whether with music, and I should mention that we have a little large dog walking around here. As I assume also, you're going to tell me that, hey, it's also nice to have a loving pet because that's going to have the same effect as music.
Well,
right?
that's another form of therapy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's become common that they bring dogs in nursing homes and for for elderly patients.
And then you also deal with the dietary issues as well.
Yes.
I mean, those are three things that we can all control when we're not feeling well.
It's true, and we could have almost the same discussion about the brain and diet. That I'm a gluten sensitivity expert. I've developed the test for that at my online lab, interolab.com. And depression and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and others have been associated with gluten sensitivity, and you can treat the gluten sensitivity and the what I call psychoneurologic syndromes go away. So it's not hard to fathom that the diet affects the brain, because the brain chemistry is all fed. All these neurotransmitters that are keeping our brain working are all diet related, amino acid related. And it's even shown, what type of diet you choose affects not only your value system, your behavior, violent crime and troubled teens, they've shown improving diet improves their outcomes, behavioral outcomes.
And what is your diet? Describe your diet.
Well, that's funny.
We only have about a minute left.
Okay. So my diet is what people often call a raw food diet.
Okay.
And I got onto that when I started a gluten-free diet, and I wanted to try it so I could identify with what I was asking patients to do way back when. I was the first doctor to use a gluten-free diet for anything but celiac disease. And I just kept taking it further because I myself am a patient too. I have a congenital arthritic syndrome since I was a teen, and I control that entirely now with my diet.
So if people can make one change in their diet, what would it be?
If I was going to limit it to one, I'd say remove the antigenic foods, the thing I'm specialized in. Gluten, grains, legumes, soy, yeast, these things that are striking up all this immunoreactivity that is now, the health plague of today.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kenneth Fine. Rock inspirational?
Rockspirational. It's a new word.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
I quickly, my eyes just went over the IN. It's not inspirational. It's rockspirational.
Yeah, it's just a neologism.
Just a play on the words.
Yeah.
And you get this on your website?
Yeah, so KennyDavidFine.com will get you there, and I've got samples of all 26 songs. It's my biggest project yet. It's 2 full CDs.
Good thing you have insurance. The lady in front of you just called that Bernstein.
Enough said. Call Ed. EdBernstein.com.